Sometimes life has a way of backing you into a corner. It strips away everything you thought you knew, everything you thought you had, until all that's left is you, your two hands, and whatever courage you can scrape together from the dust. For a woman named Elena Hartwell, that moment came on a blistering August morning in 1883 in a dusty little cattle town called Silveridge, Wyoming. She was fastening the last pearl button on a velvet waistcoat, her fingers moving with the precision of a master craftsman. The man wearing it was the man she was going to marry, the man she loved more than life itself. She finished her work, smoothed the lapels, and watched him turn to face her, a brilliant smile on his handsome face, and then she watched him ride out of town to marry another woman. Before we dive into this incredible story of love, betrayal, and jaw-dropping justice, do me a favor and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to it. Elena had arrived in Silveridge 3 years earlier, a world away from the Boston society she'd left behind. She had nothing but a worn-out carpet bag and a handful of recommendations that praised her as the finest seamstress this side of the Atlantic. At 24, she was a picture of quiet elegance, the kind of woman who made the whole church go silent when she walked in. Her little shop on Main Street, tucked neatly between the general store and the doctor's office, quickly became the beating heart of the town. It was there, on a crisp autumn afternoon, that he walked in. He called himself Lord James Ashworth, and he carried himself like he owned the very ground he walked on. He claimed to be the third son of an English Viscount, a man who had come west to build a cattle empire from scratch. The dust on his boots couldn't hide the fine London tailoring of his coat. His accent was smooth, cultured, and dripped with the kind of authority that comes from generations of wealth. "Miss Hartwell," he'd said, tipping his hat with a practiced, easy grace, "I'm told your work is without equal. I find myself in desperate need of a proper wardrobe for the social season." Elena's hands, usually so steady, trembled as she took his measurements. The scent of him, bergamot and expensive leather, filled her small shop, and it felt like the whole world was shrinking down to just the two of them. He had that dangerous kind of magnetism, sandy hair that caught the light, eyes the color of winter sage, and a smile that promised a life of adventure far beyond the dusty horizons of Wyoming. It was a smile that promised everything, but it was a smile built on a devastating lie. Their courtship was a masterpiece of slow, deliberate seduction, as carefully stitched together as one of her finest gowns. James would show up for his fittings every Tuesday, and each week he'd stay a little longer. They'd talk for hours about books, about music, about his grand plans for the Ashworth Ranch, a staggering 15,000 acres he'd supposedly purchased sight unseen. He'd paint these incredible pictures with his words. He spoke of importing prize-winning Hereford cattle from the rolling hills of England. He described in vivid detail the grand mansion he would build, a palace on the prairie that would make the homes in Cheyenne look like shacks. He talked of hosting lavish parties that would draw the Denver elite, all desperate for an invitation. "You have an artist's soul, Elena," he would murmur, his eyes fixed on her as she worked her needle through fine wool. "When my estate is complete, you will be its lady. We will carve a piece of civilization out of this rough land, you and I." By the winter of 1882, the whole town of Silveridge treated their engagement as a foregone conclusion. Mrs. Cranston, the town's most notorious and beloved gossip, would give them a knowing smile when James escorted Elena to the church socials. The Reverend himself started speaking to them as a single unit, dropping veiled hints about available wedding dates in the spring. Even Sheriff Morrison, a man whose face was a roadmap of tough living, started tipping his hat to her with a newfound respect. He'd taken to calling her the future Mrs. Ashworth. Elena was living in a dream. She tailored her entire future around this man. She wasn't just stitching his suits. She was stitching together the life they would share. She learned to cook his favorite English meals. She bought fabrics for curtains she imagined hanging in their grand mansion. And she secretly sketched designs for the magnificent gowns she would wear as the wife of a cattle baron. She was so blinded by the brilliant future he promised that she couldn't see the dark shadows creeping in at the edges. Because the truth is, The warning signs were there all along. They were as subtle as the whisper of wind through prairie grass, easy to ignore if you weren't listening for them. But they were there. The letters from his family lawyers in London always seemed to arrive on days when she was too swamped with work to get a good look at the postmarks. His stories about his childhood home were always shifting, the details changing with each telling. One week the stables held 20 horses, the next it was 30. Then there were his absences. He'd vanish for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Business in Cheyenne, he'd say with an easy wave of his hand. Territorial meetings with important men. But when she'd scan the society pages in the newspaper, his name was never mentioned. He spoke endlessly about his ranch, but he never, ever took her to see it. The main house is still under construction, my love, he'd explain smoothly. It's not yet fit for a lady of your quality. Any one of these things should have been a red flag. A single inconsistency should have planted a seed of doubt. But Elena was a woman in love, and a woman in love has a remarkable talent for explaining away the impossible. When a friend mentioned seeing James in a very intense private conversation with a stunningly dressed woman down by the train depot, Elena convinced herself it was just a business associate. When his letters from England stopped coming altogether, she blamed it on the winter mail service. She was clinging to the dream with all her might. She had no idea she was about to face a nightmare. The morning of August 15th, 1883, started with a strange, frantic energy. James arrived at her shop before the sun had even properly risen. He was carrying a suit she had never seen before, a stunning burgundy velvet jacket with matching trousers, and a silk waistcoat of breathtaking quality. He was breathless, his eyes wide and panicked. Elena, my darling, he said, his accent thicker than she'd ever heard it, a sure sign of nerves. I need your help, immediately. There's been a sudden development, an opportunity I cannot miss, and I must look my absolute best. The suit was a work of art, no doubt about it, but it was wrinkled from travel, and there were small signs of hasty alterations. He explained that his family had sent it from London on a special courier, but it needed her expert touch to be perfect. Only she could do it, he insisted. What's the occasion, James? She asked, her professional instincts kicking in. She threaded a needle, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. A meeting, he said, his eyes darting around the room, never quite landing on her, with territorial investors, men who could make or break our entire future. Everything, Elena, everything depends on the impression I make today. For 3 solid hours she worked. Her needle flew, her focus absolute. She took in the waist of the jacket, shortened the cuffs of the trousers, and adjusted the buttons on the waistcoat so it lay perfectly against his chest. She was a master at her craft, and this was some of her finest work. But the entire time, James was unnervingly still. The usual easy chatter was gone, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. You seem nervous, she observed, smoothing a lapel. This meeting, it will determine our future, he said, and his voice was heavy, filled with a strange kind of finality. Everything I have worked for, everything we have dreamed of, comes down to today. She heard those words and thought he meant their future, their dreams. She thought this was the final hurdle before he could finally, officially, ask for her hand in marriage. She imagined him making the big announcement that very night, maybe even presenting her with a ring. The anxiety she felt was a mirror of his own, the nervous excitement before a great triumph. But as she put in the final stitch, she noticed things that should have screamed danger. The obsessive way he kept checking his pocket watch, the way he paced her small shop like a caged animal. And most peculiar of all, he insisted on taking the clothes with him instead of changing right there, which he always did. I'll dress at the hotel, he said, his explanation rushed. These men, they value punctuality above all else. By the time she finished, the sun was high in the sky. James stood before her full-length mirror, turning this way and that. The transformation was breathtaking. He looked every inch the aristocratic cattle baron, the English lord she believed him to be. He was magnificent. Perfect, he whispered, though she wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. Absolutely perfect. He turned to her then, and for a fleeting, heartbreaking moment, She saw something in his eyes. It looked like regret. He stepped forward and cupped her face in his hands, his touch surprisingly tender. Elena, he started, then stopped, like the words were stuck in his throat. I want you to know what we've had. It has meant everything to me, more than you will ever know. A chill went down her spine. James, you sound like you're saying goodbye. Not goodbye, he said too quickly. Never goodbye. But if things should change, I want you to remember that this was real. The happiest moments of my life were spent right here, in this little shop, just watching you. She tried to laugh it off, to chalk it up to nerves before his big meeting. You'll be wonderful today, and tonight you can tell me all about it over dinner. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. It was a long, gentle kiss, almost reverent, as if he were trying to memorize the feel of her skin. You are an extraordinary woman, Elena Hartwell, he said softly. Don't you ever let anyone tell you different. And with that, he was gone. He gathered his freshly tailored suit and walked out of her shop, leaving her standing alone in a silence that felt heavy and suffocating. She couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't just fixed a suit. She felt like she had just armed a soldier for a battle she didn't understand. A battle that was about to destroy her entire world. The truth, when it came, wasn't delivered by James. It didn't come with an explanation or an apology. It came in the form of Mrs. Cranston, who burst through the door of the dress shop late that afternoon, her face pale and her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and pity. Elena, my dear child, she gasped, clutching her chest. She'd clearly run all the way down Main Street in the sweltering August heat. There's been, oh Lord, how do I even say this? It's James, Mr. Ashworth. He got married. The measuring tape slipped from Elena's numb fingers and coiled on the floor like a dead snake. The world tilted on its axis, the shelves of fabric blurring into a meaningless swirl of color. I beg your pardon? This morning, Mrs. Cranston continued, her voice a horrified whisper, at the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne, to a Miss Victoria Peyton, the daughter of that railroad magnate, Silas Peyton. The announcement just came over the telegraph. They're calling it the Society Wedding of the Decade, a union of two of the territory's most powerful families. Elena's legs gave out from under her, and she sank into her sewing chair, the one where he had sat for so many hours, watching her work. That's not possible, she whispered, her voice a thread. He's in a meeting with investors. He's wearing the suit. The suit I just finished for him this morning. Mrs. Cranston's face crumpled with pity, and she reached out, placing a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. Oh, my dear sweet girl, she said softly. That wasn't a suit for investors. That was his wedding suit. And just like that, the pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with a brutal, devastating clarity. The frantic urgency of that morning, the fine suit he'd never worn before, his nervousness, his strange, final-sounding words, his talk of a day that would determine his entire future. It had all been a lie, a carefully constructed, cruel performance. He hadn't been preparing for a business meeting. He had been preparing for his own wedding. And she, the woman who loved him, the woman who thought she was going to be his bride, had been the one to make sure he looked perfect for it. She had dressed her beloved for his wedding to another woman. The humiliation was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Every breath was a fresh wave of agony. The life she had planned, the future she had so carefully designed, had vanished into thin air, like a prairie mirage. But he talked about us, she whispered to the empty room long after Mrs. Cranston had left. He talked about marriage. The silence that answered was mocking. She sat there for hours, motionless, as the afternoon sun bled into evening, casting long, lonely shadows across her workshop. The tools of her trade, the needles, the thimbles, the spools of bright thread, seemed to be jeering at her. They were symbols of her skill, the very skill that had been used to facilitate her own heartbreak. Soon other townspeople started to arrive. They came bearing condolences and a morbid curiosity they tried to hide behind sympathetic eyes. Mrs. Henderson from the millinery shop brought a pot of tea that Elena couldn't drink. Young Sarah Mitchell, the Reverend's daughter, offered to help her close up the shop. Even Sheriff Morrison stopped by, holding his hat in his hands, his weathered face etched with a genuine, awkward concern. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice gruff, "any man who treats a lady like that, well, he ain't worth the salt in your tears. You got more dignity in your little finger than that fella has in his whole damn body." But dignity was cold comfort when your heart had been ripped out of your chest. Late that night, as she finally locked the shop door and climbed the stairs to her empty apartment, she felt like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. Every object held a memory. Every corner of the room echoed with a conversation that was now nothing but a lie. She was utterly and completely alone. Just past midnight, a soft knock came at her door. For one wild, foolish moment, her heart leaped. "James, he's come back. There's been a mistake. He's come to explain." But when she opened the door, it wasn't him. It was young Tommy Patterson, the doctor's son. He was holding a single, crisp envelope. Her name was written on the front in James's elegant, familiar script. "Sorry to bother you so late, Miss Hartwell," the boy mumbled, shifting his feet. "The gentleman, he paid me to give this to you after 10 o'clock. Said it was real important you didn't get it before then." Her hands shook so badly she could barely break the seal. Inside was a letter, and with every line she read, her heart, which she thought couldn't possibly break anymore, shattered into a million more pieces. It was a confession, and it was so much worse than she could have ever imagined. The letter was a masterpiece of cruel poetry, each word a carefully chosen dagger. "My dearest Elena," it began, "by the time you read these words, I will be a married man. I know this news will cause you unimaginable pain, and for that, I am more sorry than language can convey. The time we spent together was the only true happiness I have ever known. But I am not the man you believe me to be." He went on to explain that his marriage to Victoria Peyton was not a choice, but an obligation, an arrangement made between their powerful families when they were just children, a business merger, sealed with a wedding vow. He had come west, he claimed, to escape it, to find a life of his own, to find real love. And he had found it, with her. "I should have told you the truth from the start," he wrote. "But I was a coward. I was selfish. I wanted to feel what it was like to be truly loved, even if it was only for a little while. Please do not think what we shared was false. Every laugh, every conversation, every tender touch was real. You showed me what a marriage should be, a partnership of the heart, not a contract between fortunes." The letter ended with a final, devastating blow. As a token of his deepest regret, and as inadequate compensation for his deception, he had arranged for the deed to the house at 412 Elm Street to be transferred to her name. He had also opened an account for her at the First National Bank, with enough money to ensure she would never have to work again. "These gifts cannot mend the damage I have caused," the letter concluded, "but I hope they can provide you with some measure of security. I will carry the memory of your love with me for the rest of my days. Forever in your debt, James." She read it once, twice, 3 times. The words swam before her eyes, a blur of elegant script and calculated cruelty. Even in his betrayal, he had to be the star of his own drama. He cast himself not as a villain, not as a liar and a cheat, but as a tragic hero, a victim of circumstance. He hadn't chosen wealth over love. He had been forced into it. And the house, the money, it wasn't a gift. It was a payment. It was hush money. It transformed their beautiful romance into a sordid business transaction. She felt cheap, used. She crumpled the letter in her fist, the paper crackling in the suffocating silence of her apartment. The next few weeks were a blur of numb existence. The house on Elm Street was beautiful, a 2-story home with carved woodwork and bay windows, big enough for the family she had dreamed of having with him. Walking through its empty rooms was like touring a museum dedicated to her own failure. It was a beautiful cage, paid for by her own humiliation. She barely left the house. The townspeople, meaning well, would bring by food and flowers, but their pity was like acid on an open wound. She could hear their whispers when they thought she wasn't listening. Such a respectable young woman. Who would have thought? She had become a cautionary tale, the woman who was publicly and spectacularly jilted. To escape the prying eyes and suffocating sympathy, she began taking long walks at dawn and dusk, wandering out onto the prairie, where the only judgment came from the vast, empty sky. It was out there, by the quiet banks of Willow Creek, that she met him. She was watching the water flow over the rocks when the sound of hoofbeats broke the silence. She looked up to see a soldier, a man in the blue uniform of the Territorial Cavalry, his sleeves bearing the stripes of a sergeant. He was maybe in his early 30s with a kind, weathered face and steady brown eyes. He reined in his horse at a respectful distance. "Pardon me, miss," he called out, his voice calm and even. "Are you all right? This is a fair way from town for a lady to be on her own." "I'm fine," she said, her voice sounding rusty from disuse. "Just enjoying the quiet." "Mind if I water my horse?" he asked. She nodded, and he dismounted, leading the big bay horse to the creek's edge. He moved with an easy confidence, but she noticed he was careful to give her plenty of space. He wasn't like James. There was no pretense, no performance. He was just there. "Name's Daniel Mackenzie," he said simply. "Stationed out of Fort Laramie. Just patrolling this section for a bit." "Ella Hartwell," she replied. If he recognized the name, if he knew the gossip that had consumed the town for weeks, he gave no sign. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the gurgle of the creek and the soft snorts of his horse. For the first time since that horrible morning, a tiny bit of the tension in her shoulders began to ease. "Beautiful country out here," he said after a while. "Different from back home in Ohio." "You're a long way from home," she observed. He gave a small, thoughtful smile and looked out at the horizon. "Sometimes a man's got to go a long way to see things clear." He glanced at her then, and his eyes were filled with a quiet, profound understanding. Sometimes a woman does too. And in that moment, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was something close. She found herself drawn back to that spot by the creek day after day. She told herself it was for the solitude, for the quiet beauty of the prairie, but she knew deep down she was hoping to see him again. And she usually did. Daniel's patrol route seemed to bring him by Willow Creek with surprising regularity. Their conversations were simple, easy things. They talked about the weather, about the way the colors of the prairie were shifting as summer gave way to autumn. Unlike James, who had filled every second of silence with his grand stories and dramatic plans, Daniel was content to just be quiet. He could sit for an hour, just watching the clouds drift by, and his calm presence was like a balm on her raw nerves. He didn't demand anything from her. He didn't need to be the center of attention. He just was. One afternoon, he noticed the calluses on her fingers. "You're a seamstress, aren't you?" he asked. He'd seen her mending a small tear in her skirt with a needle and thread she carried in a small pouch. "I have a shop in town," she confirmed, not offering any more. He nodded, a distant look in his eyes. "My mother was a seamstress back in Cincinnati. She had this knack for it. Could look at a fellow once and know his measurements by heart. Said she could tell a man's character by the way his clothes were stitched." "Is she still—" "Passed on about 5 years back," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Consumption. She left me her thimble and a little box of buttons. I keep 'em in my saddlebag. Can't sew worth a damn myself, but feels right to have 'em." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Elena felt a genuine smile touch her lips. "I could teach you," she offered, "some basic mending. A soldier ought to know how to repair his own gear." His face lit up. "I'd appreciate that, ma'am, but I'm warning you, I'm about as graceful with a needle as a grizzly bear with a teacup." Their lessons started the next week. He'd bring a torn shirt or a pair of socks with a hole in the heel, and she would patiently guide his large, clumsy hands through the delicate work of stitching. He was a terrible student, but a determined one, and he laughed at his own mistakes. His easy good humor was infectious, and she found herself laughing along with him. The sound felt foreign in her own ears, but wonderful. "There," she said one evening, inspecting his lumpy but functional attempt at darning a sock. "That's much better. Your mother would be proud." He held it up, a grin on his face. "You think so? Looks more like a relief map of the Rocky Mountains to me." He looked at her then, his expression turning serious. Thank you, Elena, for this. She knew he wasn't just talking about the sewing. The quiet hours they spent by the creek were slowly stitching her back together. His steady, unassuming kindness was a thread, pulling the frayed edges of her soul back into place. He never asked about James. He never mentioned the scandal. He never treated her like a victim. He just treated her like Elena, a woman with a skill, a woman with a quiet strength he seemed to recognize and admire. She was starting to feel like herself again. But the past had a way of refusing to stay buried. Just as the first hint of autumn chilled the air, a ghost from her past rode back into town. Mrs. Cranston, a reliable harbinger of dramatic news, burst into her shop, breathless once again. "He's back," she announced, her eyes wide. "That scoundrel. He checked into the hotel this morning. And Elena, he's asking for you." The half-finished dress she was working on fell from her hands. James was back. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, panicked bird beating its wings against a cage. A part of her had dreaded this moment, while another, darker part had secretly longed for it. She didn't know if she wanted to scream at him or run from him. "Did he say what he wants?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper. "Claims he has unfinished business." Mrs. Cranston sniffed with disdain. "Had the gall to ask if you were receiving callers. The nerve of that man!" Elena didn't have to wait long. That very afternoon, the bell above her shop door chimed, and there he was. He looked just the same, impossibly handsome, impeccably dressed, radiating that same old confident charm. But she saw him differently now. She could see the calculation behind the smile, the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Elena," he said, his voice a soft, intimate murmur. "You look well." She stood up, putting her sewing table between them like a shield. "What do you want, James?" "To apologize," he said, taking a step closer. "To explain. To try and make things right, if that's even possible." "You made your choice," she said, her voice colder and harder than she'd ever heard it. "I don't think there's anything left to explain." "I made the wrong choice," he said, his voice laced with a theatrical desperation. "The marriage, it's a disaster, Elena. Victoria is a cold, heartless woman, interested only in her social standing and her father's money. There's no love, no connection, not like we had." "And what precisely does that have to do with me?" "Everything," he said, his voice rising with passion. He moved around the table, trying to close the distance between them. "I was a fool. I see that now. I threw away the only real thing in my life. Elena, I'm going to leave her. I'll face the scandal. I don't care. We can go away. California, maybe. Start over. Just the two of us, where nobody knows our story." The offer hung in the air between them, the very words she had sobbed herself to sleep, wishing she would hear just a few weeks ago. But now they sounded hollow, pathetic. "You want me to be your mistress," she said, her voice flat. "No, I want you to be my wife. The way it was always meant to be. My marriage to Victoria was a business deal. It was never real, not in my heart. You are the woman I love, Elena. You've always been the one." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and she didn't see the dashing lord or the tragic hero. She saw a weak, selfish man running from the consequences of his own choices. He wasn't here because he loved her. He was here because his new, shiny life wasn't as perfect as he'd hoped, and he wanted to crawl back to the comfort and adoration she had so freely given him. She was his escape plan, his consolation prize, and a quiet, powerful rage began to burn in her chest. "No," she said. The word was soft, but it landed with the force of a hammer blow. He stared at her, genuinely shocked. He had clearly expected tears, recriminations, and then, ultimately, forgiveness. He had not expected this calm, unshakable refusal. "What do you mean, no?" "No, James," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "I will not be your escape route. I will not be the woman you run to when your calculated ambitions don't work out. You had a choice, a very clear choice between a life of advantage and a life of love. And you chose advantage. Now that your advantage has proven to be disappointing, you want love back. as if you can just pick it up from where you discarded it. She took a breath, the words pouring out of her now, cleansing and fierce. But you can't, because everything has changed. I have changed. He argued. He pleaded. He promised her the world, just like he had before. But the spell was broken. The man she had loved was an illusion, a character he had played to perfection. The man standing in front of her was a stranger, and she felt nothing for him but a cold, hard pity. When he finally left, his handsome face twisted with a frustrated, ugly anger. She didn't feel a single pang of heartbreak. All she felt was a profound, liberating sense of relief. She had finally closed the door on that chapter of her life. 2 days later, Daniel showed up at her shop. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Heard James Ashworth was in town," he said, his jaw tight. "Heard he paid you a visit. Are you all right?" She looked at this good, steady man, and she considered the question. Was she all right? "Yes," she said, and she was surprised to find that it was the absolute truth. "I believe I am." Daniel nodded, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. But then his expression sobered. "Lila Nina, I got new orders. I'm being transferred to Fort Robinson up in Nebraska. I'm leaving tomorrow morning." A sharp, unexpected pang of loss hit her. In just a few short weeks, his quiet friendship had become an anchor for her. She hadn't realized how much she had come to rely on it until the moment it was being taken away. "I'll miss our sewing lessons," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He stepped a little closer, his gaze direct and sincere. "Elena," he began, his voice careful. "I know this is presumptuous, and I know you've been hurt something awful. But if you ever decided you wanted a fresh start, if you ever thought you might want to try again with a man who would never, ever make you question his intentions, well, I'd be honored to court you, properly, with respect and patience and complete honesty." She looked into his kind, steady eyes and saw everything that James was not. Sincerity, strength, a quiet, deep-running integrity. It was tempting, so tempting. But she wasn't ready to leap from one man to another. She needed to stand on her own 2 feet first. "I'm not ready," she said gently. "Not yet." He nodded, not a hint of disappointment on his face, only understanding. "I know, but if you ever are, you know where to find me. Fort Robinson ain't so far that a determined woman couldn't make the trip." He turned to leave, then paused at the door and looked back at her, his expression serious. "Elena," he said, "you deserve a hell of a lot better than being some man's second choice. Don't you ever forget that." She watched him walk down the street until he disappeared around the corner. And for the first time since that terrible August morning, she found herself thinking not about the past that had been stolen from her, but about a future she might actually get to choose for herself. The wheels were turning. An idea was beginning to form, an idea that was both terrifying and thrilling. Silveridge was the site of her greatest humiliation, but perhaps it could also be the site of her greatest victory. She thought about James, about his lies, about the strange suit, and about the man Daniel had described, the one who could tell a man's character from his stitches. She realized her mother was right. The clues were always there, hidden in the threads, and she was the only one who knew how to read them. 3 months passed. The autumn leaves fell, and the first snows dusted the peaks of the distant mountains. Elena did something no one in Silveridge expected. She didn't wither away in heartbroken solitude. She didn't pack her bags and flee in shame. She worked. She poured all of her pain, all of her anger, and all of her meticulous skill into her craft. Her shop flourished, but in the quiet hours of the night, her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about that burgundy velvet suit. The memory of it was burned into her mind. The strange wrinkles from travel. The way James, or whatever his real name was, had been so frantic. The story about his family sending it via special courier. It had all felt wrong then, and it felt even more wrong now. A man like James, so obsessed with appearances, would never wear a suit that had been hastily altered by someone else. He would have had it made to measure. One night, while sweeping the floor of her workroom, her broom caught on a loose floorboard. Prying it up, she found a small dark space beneath, And there, tucked away in the corner, was a scrap of fabric, a tiny forgotten remnant of burgundy velvet that must have fallen while she was working on the suit. Her heart started to pound. She held it up to the lamplight. It was just a tiny piece, but on it was a single, stray thread of a different color, a deep, almost black, crimson. At the time, she might have dismissed it as a simple flaw in the fabric, but now it looked sinister. She brought it closer, her nose wrinkling at a faint, almost imperceptible smell. It wasn't the scent of bergamot and leather that she associated with James. It was something else, something coppery and metallic, something that smelled like old fear. Her mind raced back to Daniel's words. His mother could tell a man's character from his stitches. Elena realized she could do more. She could read a man's secrets. That suit hadn't just been altered. It had been damaged and repaired, hastily. This wasn't just about a broken heart anymore. This was about something much, much darker. She took the scrap of fabric and the memory of that smell to the one person in town who might listen. The one person who had looked at her not with pity, but with a flicker of shared suspicion. Sheriff Morrison. She found him in his office, chewing on an unlit cigar. She laid the fabric scrap on his desk. "Sheriff," she said, her voice low and steady, "I think Lord James Ashworth is more than just a liar. I think he might be a criminal." The sheriff looked from the scrap of fabric to her determined face. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his lips. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I've been waiting for someone to say that out loud for the better part of 2 years. Pull up a chair. Tell me everything you know." What followed was the unraveling of a conspiracy so audacious it almost defied belief. The sheriff, it turned out, had been deeply suspicious of Lord Ashworth from the day he arrived. He'd sent inquiries back east, but without any proof of a crime, his hands were tied. Elena's story, her intimate knowledge of the man and his habits, was the key he'd been missing. Together they started piecing it together. The sheriff had a friend, a U.S. Marshal, who owed him a favor. A telegraph was sent. The reply that came back a week later blew the case wide open. There was indeed a Lord James Ashworth, third son of a Viscount. He was a quiet, bookish man who had come to Wyoming not to build a cattle empire, but to study prairie flora. He had arrived in Cheyenne 2 years prior, and then he had vanished without a trace. His family in England had been searching for him ever since. The man Elena knew, the charming, magnetic imposter, was a con man from back east named Jack Driscoll. He was a known swindler who preyed on wealthy women. But this was different. This wasn't just fraud. The timing of the real Lord Ashworth's disappearance and Jack Driscoll's sudden appearance with a new title and a pocket full of cash was too perfect to be a coincidence. "And Victoria Peyton?" Elena asked, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. "Her father, Silas, is as crooked as a dog's hind leg," the sheriff grumbled. "He's been buying up land with railroad money under shady circumstances for years. A partnership with a supposed English lord would give his dirty business a veneer of legitimacy. I'd bet my last dollar they were in on it together." The puzzle was almost complete. Jack Driscoll had likely ambushed the real Lord Ashworth, stolen his identity, his money, and his fine clothes. That burgundy suit, it hadn't belonged to Jack. It had belonged to his victim. The alterations Elena had made weren't for fit. They were to repair damage from a struggle. And that faint, dark stain, it wasn't a flaw in the fabric. It was a blood stain. Elena felt sick. She had been courted by a monster. She had touched him. She had laughed with him. She had loved him. And all the while he was wearing another man's clothes, living another man's life, a life he had almost certainly taken by force. "We have motive. We have a timeline," the sheriff said, pacing his office. "But we have no body. And without a body, we have no proof of murder. Jack Driscoll is smart. He's covered his tracks. Right now, all we can get him on is fraud and impersonation." "There has to be something," Elena insisted, her mind racing. "Something I missed. A detail. A stitch." And then it hit her. The buttons on the waistcoat. When she had been adjusting them, she'd noticed one was slightly different from the others. It was an antique pearl button, intricately carved, while the others were plain. At the time, she'd assumed it was a simple replacement. But now, "The buttons, Sheriff," she said, her voice rising with excitement. One of them was different. It was a family crest, a small bird, a hawk or a falcon, inside a shield. I remember it perfectly. The sheriff stopped pacing. He stared at her. "The Ashworth family crest," he whispered, his eyes wide. "It's a peregrine falcon." Jack Driscoll, in his haste to have the suit repaired, had made a mistake. He'd replaced a missing button, but he'd used one of the real Lord Ashworth's cufflink buttons, not realizing it bore the family crest. It was a tiny detail, a single stitch out of place in his grand deception. But it was enough. It was the proof they needed to link the suit, and the man wearing it, to the missing lord. "He'll be back," Elena said, a cold certainty settling over her. "He got away with it once. He's arrogant. He'll think he can come back here and no one will be the wiser. He has business with the Paytons." "And when he does," the sheriff said, grabbing his hat, "we'll be ready for him." The trap was set. Now all they had to do was wait for the spider to walk back into the web. Elena was no longer a victim. She was the bait. The wait was agonizing. Weeks turned into a month. Winter settled over Silveridge, blanketing the town in a heavy, silent shroud of snow. Elena kept her shop open, going through the motions of her daily life. But every chime of the bell above her door sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Every out-of-town stranger made her heart leap into her throat. She had sent a letter to Daniel at Fort Robinson, a carefully worded message letting him know that things in Silveridge were unsettled and that she had business to attend to. She didn't want to involve him, to put him in danger. This was her fight. Finally, in late January, he came. He rode into town not as the flamboyant Lord Ashworth, but as the quiet, respectable Mr. Jack Payton, having taken his wife's name. He was there, he announced publicly, to oversee the final acquisitions for his father-in-law's new ranching enterprise. The town, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, greeted him with the deference due to a man of his supposed wealth. He didn't come to her shop, not at first. He paraded around town with Victoria on his arm, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He was untouchable, and he knew it, or so he thought. The sheriff wanted to arrest him immediately, but Elena urged caution. "He's too smart, Sheriff. He'll have an explanation for everything. We need to catch him in a lie he can't escape. We need to confront him with something only the killer would know." Her chance came 3 days after his arrival. He sent a message to her shop, a simple note requesting her services at the hotel. A new suit of his required minor adjustments. It was a test, a power play. He was summoning her, the jilted lover, to serve him once again. He wanted to see if she was broken. He wanted to gloat. She walked to the hotel, her sewing kit in hand, her heart hammering but her resolve like steel. The sheriff and 2 of his deputies were stationed discreetly across the street, ready to move in at her signal. She found him in his hotel suite. Victoria was there, a cold, beautiful statue of a woman draped in silks and jewels. She looked at Elena up and down with undisguised contempt. "You may begin," Victoria said, waving a dismissive hand towards a suit laid out on the bed. Jack just watched her, a cruel, amused smirk playing on his lips. "It's good to see you again, Elena. I trust you've been well, enjoying the gifts I left for you?" Elena ignored him. She picked up the jacket and began her examination, her fingers tracing the seams with practiced ease. But she wasn't looking at the stitching. She was looking at him. "This is fine work," she said, her voice calm and even. "But there seems to be a button missing from the waistcoat." Jack's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "Is there? Well, see to it then. Replace it." "Of course," she said, pulling a small box of buttons from her kit. She rummaged through them for a moment before looking up, her eyes locking with his. "I might even have one that matches the original set from that lovely burgundy suit you wore in August. A beautiful design. A small bird, wasn't it? A falcon, I believe." The color drained from Jack Driscoll's face. The air in the room went still and silent. Victoria shot him a sharp, panicked look. In that single frozen moment, he knew. He knew that she knew. The game was over. His charming facade melted away, replaced by the raw, vicious snarl of a cornered animal. "You clever little witch," he hissed, taking a step towards her. "You should have just taken the money and kept your mouth shut." "What is she talking about, Jack?" Victoria demanded, her voice shrill with panic. "Shut up!" He barked at his wife, his eyes never leaving Elena's. He lunged for her, his hands reaching for her throat. But Elena was ready. In one swift, fluid motion, she brought up her right hand. It wasn't holding a button. It was holding the long, wicked-looking pair of shears she always kept in her kit. The steel blades glinted in the lamplight. "Don't take another step," she said, her voice ringing with a power he had never heard before. He froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. The timid little seamstress was gone. In her place stood a woman made of iron. "It's over, Jack," she said. "Or whatever your real name is. The sheriff knows everything. About the real Lord Ashworth, about the suit, about the button." Just then, the door to the suite burst open. Sheriff Morrison and his deputies stormed in, guns drawn. "Jack Driscoll, you're under arrest for fraud, impersonation, and the murder of Lord James Ashworth." Jack let out a roar of fury and lunged, not at Elena, but towards the window, trying to make a desperate escape. But it was no use. The deputies tackled him, and the fight was over in seconds. Victoria Peyton let out a scream as they slapped the iron cuffs on her husband's wrists. She began to sob, not for her husband, but for herself. Her family's name, their reputation, was ruined. As they dragged a cursing and struggling Jack Driscoll out of the room, he looked back at Elena one last time, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression calm and steady. She had faced her monster, and she had won. Her greatest pain had become her greatest weapon. The love that had almost destroyed her had, in the end, forged her into something unbreakable. The trial was the biggest event Wyoming territory had ever seen. People came from all over to witness the downfall of the great imposter, Jack Driscoll. Elena was the star witness. She took the stand, not as a scorned woman seeking revenge, but as a calm, credible witness laying out the facts. She spoke of the suit, the alterations, the stain, and the button with the falcon crest. Her testimony, delivered with quiet dignity and unshakable certainty, was what sealed his fate. Faced with a mountain of evidence, one of Driscoll's hired ranch hands confessed. He led the authorities to a remote canyon on the old Peyton land, where they found the shallow grave of the real Lord James Ashworth. Jack Driscoll was sentenced to hang. The Peyton Empire crumbled under the weight of the scandal, their lands seized and their name disgraced. Justice, swift and terrible, had finally been served. Elena sold her shop. She sold the house on Elm Street, the house that had once been her prison, and donated a large portion of the money to establish a fund for women in the territory, starting their own businesses. She had become something of a legend in Silveridge, a symbol of resilience and strength. But she knew she couldn't stay. The town would always be filled with ghosts. With a small satchel and a heart that was finally, truly at peace, she boarded the morning stagecoach to Nebraska. She found Daniel at Fort Robinson. He was older now, his face a little more weathered, his shoulders a little broader with the weight of his responsibilities. But his eyes, when they saw her, were the same, filled with that same quiet, steady kindness that had been her lifeline. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, taking both of her hands in his. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted with a small smile. "But I had some unfinished business to attend to. I'm finished now." Their courtship was nothing like the whirlwind romance she'd had with James. It was slow and gentle and real. It was built on shared silence on long walks, on easy laughter over simple meals, on the comforting knowledge that she was safe and cherished and seen for exactly who she was. One spring evening, as the sun set over the plains, casting the world in hues of gold and lavender, Daniel got down on one knee. He didn't have a fancy speech prepared. He just held out a simple, unadorned gold ring. "Elena Hartwell," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you do me the honor of being my wife? Not because of any arrangement, not because it's expected, but because I love you, and because I think we could build a good, quiet life together." She looked at this honest, decent man, and she thought about the woman she had been just a year ago, a woman who had tailored her whole life to fit the dreams of a liar. She had traveled so far since then, not just in miles but in spirit. She had been stripped of everything, and in the emptiness, she had found herself. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and joyful. "Yes, Daniel, I would like that very much." Their wedding was a small, simple affair in the fort's chapel. There were no society pages, no fancy gowns, no talk of fortunes and empires. There was just the two of them, and a handful of friends, and a love that was as solid and dependable as the earth beneath their feet. Sometimes life strips everything away, but sometimes if you're brave enough, if you're strong enough, you can take your two hands and stitch together a future that is more beautiful and more real than anything you ever dared to dream. Elena Hartwell, the seamstress from Silveridge, had done just that, and in the steady, loving hands of a good soldier, she had finally, truly found her way home. What an incredible journey of resilience and justice. It just goes to show you that sometimes the quietest people have the strongest spirits. If you enjoyed this story, I'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We post stories like this all the time, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.